Next up, I'm joined by Chuck Rosenberg. Throughout his career, Chuck has held numerous senior positions in the United States Department of Justice as the United States Attorney, the Chief Law Enforcement Office, a counselor to the Attorney General of the United States, Chief of Staff to the Deputy Attorney General, and as the Administrator of the Drug Enforcement Administration. Tonight, we discuss where America goes from here and the role of the rule of law in today's society. Chuck, thanks so much for being here.
My pleasure, Michael. Thanks for having me.
Legally speaking, what most worries you about the night of November 3rd?
Every election in American history has ended with a concession, which is really pretty remarkable if you think about it, that the loser concedes the election, even though he, and so far it's always been he, could probably contest it in some way, in some state, in some manner. Even after Bush v. Gore, when Gore could have pushed the issue in other states, he accepted the decision of the Supreme Court, and that day conceded to President Bush. Those norms, right, the way we conduct ourselves between the lines of the rules are so important to governance in America and also to elections in America. And that's what worries me, a departure from norms, or I should say, a further departure from norms.
Do you worry about attempts to marginalize the Department of Justice if, in fact, there's not a concession on election night?
Well, I always worry about the Department of Justice because that's where I grew up professionally, and I love it, and I care deeply about it. And I've also watched over the last 3+ years what I think has happened to it. So, yes, I do worry about it being marginalized. I worry about it being politicized, and I worry about it not maintaining its reputation for fairness, at least the reputation I ascribe to it.
Where and for what do you believe that President Trump faces potential legal jeopardy should he lose this election and no longer be cloaked with the protection that he has today?
Well, the protection he has today, let's be clear, comes from policy, not from law. It's the policy of the Department of Justice, and that policy was issued both under President Nixon and President Clinton, that a sitting president can't be charged, can't be indicted while in office. That policy doesn't apply to any state. And so even though he doesn't face jeopardy today from the Department of Justice, the federal Department of Justice, he does from any state in which he may have committed a crime. Look, this is a thing that I've thought about a lot, Michael, and I don't really know what to think. Let me explain that, because that I know that sounds a little bit muddled. Nobody is above the law, including the president. But I would hate to have in America, this notion of a truth commission, that the incoming administration, whatever party, goes after the outgoing administration, whatever party. I believe President Trump committed crimes while in office. That's predicated in large part of the findings of the Mueller team, particularly volume 2 of their work on obstruction of justice. And so as a rule of law person, as a former federal prosecutor, I hate the notion that somebody might escape justice, not be prosecuted for what I see as prosecutable crimes. On the other hand, I don't like the idea that we seek political revenge and that we try and go after, Trump just because he's a former president, and we can. The story here, the illustrative story, is Ford's pardon of Nixon. I thought it was an extraordinary act of grace. I thought it was completely appropriate. He was excoriated for doing so. The reason he did it, Michael, is because he said we need to look forward and not backward. And interestingly, a quarter of a century after Ford issued that pardon, Senator Ted Kennedy, who was one of those excoriating Ford for pardoning Nixon, presented to an elderly Gerald Ford in the summer of 2001 the John F. Kennedy Profiles in Courage Award. He said that Ford had it right and he, Kennedy, had it wrong. And as a nation, we needed to look forward and not backward.
I think the words were, "Our long national nightmare is over." I may be mistaken. And I'm so glad that you raised this historical example from the 1970s. That, of course, could protect if, and all hypothetical, we've all seen the polls, but I should say for the two of us, we have no idea how this is about to unfold, nor who will win. But if it should be an incoming Joe Biden as president of the United States, theoretically, when he's president, he could pardon Donald Trump to the extent that Trump needed any pardonability. But he couldn't do it for state crimes, right? I mean, he couldn't protect against whatever might come out of a New York State investigation.
That's exactly right. The pardon power of a president is for federal crimes only, and he could not pardon Mr. Trump, for instance, for any crimes that violate New York state law.
Okay, how about this, Chuck? Could the president, assuming he were to lose the election, pardon himself on the way out the door?
Great question. Never been litigated. I mean, I could declare, Michael, that I'm going to be the starting center fielder for the Washington Nationals next season.
Right.
Doesn't make it true. It doesn't have any effect. I mean, could the president pardon himself? Yes. Is it legal? Is it lawful? Is it legitimate? Would it be upheld? I don't know. I don't think so, because it doesn't sound right to me. But we've never litigated it because no president has ever done it.
With regard to President Trump, is his longest lasting legacy, apart from the personal attributes and the pluses and minuses of the way in which he's communicated and so forth, but when you examine his record, is his longest lasting legacy the way in which he's populated the federal bench with young conservative idealistics?
Well, in a sense, yes, sure, because that will outlive him. It will outlive his presidency, and it will very likely outlive him as well. These young men and women, some of whom I know, some of whom I like, some of whom are friends, some of whom are former colleagues, and some of whom are well qualified, might be around for the next 3, 4, or 5 decades. And so, yes, absolutely, Michael, that legacy will long outlive this president.
There's been a great deal of conversation in the last several weeks, if not months, about the 25th Amendment. Does the 25th Amendment work? Does it need to be rewritten for any particular purpose?
You know, it worked for President Bush when he had a colonoscopy. In theory, at least in written word, it seems adequate to the task. This president has sort of broken so many norms that it's hard to know how things will sort of hold up under the stresses of a Trump presidency. So on paper and by practice, the 25th Amendment seems adequate to the task. Whether or not it would be sufficient to President Trump, who knows? Because, you know, one aspect of the 25th Amendment is that if a majority of his cabinet finds that he's not able to fulfill the duties of the president, they could temporarily and perhaps permanently strip him of his power. But how realistic is that? How likely is that to happen? Who would dare do that, particularly to this president who's so vindictive? And so it's hard to know whether it's adequate to the task.
Right. One component of it, you correct me if I'm wrong, but one component of it says if I'm going in for a colonoscopy and I'm going under anesthesia, then I'm going to temporarily transfer power. A different provision of it, as you were making reference to, demands that you've got the cabinet and the vice president on board to say whomever the number one is, for whatever reason right now, is not able to perform their responsibilities. It's really the second of those provisions that I was wondering, is there something else that needs to be explored?
Yeah, I agree with you. The first one seems adequate. The second one seems inadequate. It seems like it was put there as not as a filler, because I don't think that's fair, but as a catch-all, right? In other words, we can't think of every situation in which the president may be disabled, so we'll create this other category where the cabinet and the vice president can act to strip an unable president or a disabled president and take away his powers, at least temporarily. But it's not well defined. We don't know under what circumstances it would be invoked or whether a cabinet would have the political will to do it. Does it seem okay in writing? It seems okay in writing. It just seems quite distressed in practice.
The nomination of Amy Coney Barrett has put back in play discussion of things like court packing and the filibuster. Will you comment on the likelihood of each of those, meaning the expansion of the federal court, the return of the filibuster?
Sure. So I am anti-court packing, and decidedly so. I understand the impetus, I understand the frustration, I understand the anger among Democrats when a highly qualified judge, Merrick Garland, didn't even get a hearing. I get that. The history of court packing is really quite fascinating. So the Supreme Court is established by the Constitution of the United States. Lifetime tenure of federal judges and justices is established by the Constitution of the United States. The number of justices is not established by the Constitution. It's established by statute. The Judiciary Act of 1789, Michael, set that number at 6 for the Supreme Court. And the number went up and down, fluctuating between 5 and 10 until 1869. In the Judiciary Act of 1869, signed by President Grant, it was finally set at 9, and it's been 9 for 151 years since. 9 is not a magic number. It's just the number we happen to have. And again, not established by the Constitution, but by statute. That means it can be changed by statute. You know, Franklin Delano Roosevelt famously proposed changing it in 1937 because he was so upset with the Supreme Court striking down so much of his New Deal legislation. But I actually found a speech that President Taft gave in 1912 at Yale. He is the only person ever to serve as both President of the United States and Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. There must have been something bugging him in 1912 because at Yale he talked about the evils of court packing. I can't figure out what was going on back then, but this is not the first time that it has been discussed publicly. Here's the problem. Because it is by statute, it can be changed by any other Congress. Anytime the Republicans control the House and Senate and the White House, they can up the number. And if the Democrats then take the House and Senate and White House back, they can up the number. There's no limiting principle. It's a one-way ratchet, I guess, as most ratchets are. And so we would then be making the Supreme Court, which I think should be an other in American life, apart from politics, like everything else in American life, that is to say, political. I think it's an awful idea.
You wrote recently for the Washington Post that the Justice Department must be fair and perceived as fair. Why were you differentiating the two? What were you saying?
Right. So our outcomes have to be fair. They have to actually be fair. We have to treat defendants fairly. We have to follow rules of evidence and procedure, right? Everybody is entitled to their due process, to the advice of counsel, to confront and cross-examine witnesses, to a impartial jury, right? To an impartial magistrate or judge. That's actually fair, and we have to be that. But we also have to appear to be fair. And let me give you an example. The president tweeted, for instance, and spoke often about the injustices that were befalling his friends, Michael Flynn, Roger Stone, and the like. And he asked the attorney general, and he asked the attorney general to fix this thing, right? He asked the attorney general to weigh in. He asked that they be treated differently than you or I would have been treated, Michael, if we found ourselves in that sort of difficulty. And the attorney general weighed in. And it looked like he weighed in because of what the president had asked. And that's deeply problematic. In the end, a judge sentences Roger Stone. And so the outcome could actually be fair. It could be objectively fair because a judge put all of that aside when she pronounced sentence. But it appears unfair because the president didn't weigh in for you and me. He didn't weigh in for anybody else. He weighed in for his political ally and friend, Roger Stone. And so unless we're both fair and appear to be fair, there's a problem. Because if we don't appear to be fair, right, we lose that sort of that moral fiber, if you will, that objectivity, the way people perceive us, the way they think about us, whether or not they find in our work, right, a degree of procedure and normalcy that they can trust. That's what the president has eroded. And that's why being fair in and of itself is not sufficient. We also have to appear fair.
And finally, at some point after this election concludes, John Durham's investigation into the origin of the Russian probe is going to conclude. What do you think he'll find?
So I think he'll probably find what everyone else has found, what the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence has found, what the Mueller team has found, what the Inspector General has found. Lots and lots of people have looked at what John Durham is doing, right? We know there was massive Russian interference in the 2016 election. We know that the FBI appropriately and properly opened up an investigation, a counterintelligence investigation into that interference. We know from the Inspector General that political bias did not infect the work of the FBI. I don't imagine that John Durham is going to find anything very different than that. I should say this. I know John from my years in the Department of Justice. I like John, I respect John, and I trust John. It's not John that worries me. It's what happens with his report. Case in point, Michael, I deeply respect Bob Mueller. I had the privilege of working for him on the FBI on his staff after 9/11. I read the Mueller report, all 448 pages. I thought they did a spectacular job with it. And then Bill Barr, when he received it ahead of public release, I think completely distorted its findings. And the lies that Bill Barr told about the report, made it out of the gate long before the truth ever caught up. That's what I worry about. Not so much what John Durham finds, but how his political superiors might try to spin it.
A final thought on that, if I may, my own 2 cents. I too read the full report. I just think that Robert Mueller could have brought it to a different conclusion. He was refusing really to follow his own findings and say to the Congress, this is now what you have on your hands. I find that there was obstruction of justice.
I've heard that argument and I understand that argument, but can I tell you why I think I disagree with that argument?
Sure.
Yeah, we alluded to earlier Department of Justice policy that says you can't charge a sitting president. What I think the Mueller team thought is that if you can't charge a sitting president, then it wouldn't be fair to tell anybody else publicly that they ought to charge a sitting president or that you think he committed a crime. He's not able to defend himself against what you think. He's only able to defend himself in a court of law to charges that are levied against him in a proper way. And so if you can't charge him, you ought not say publicly that he ought to be charged.
Okay, but I'll just push back in this limited respect. It's a conversation I think they should have had at the outset of their work, because there was an expectation created that he was going to bring it to a conclusion one way or the other. Instead, he seemed to have served up a conclusion that there was obstruction without saying so. And why do I argue that Mueller did believe there was obstruction? Because if he didn't believe it, he would have told us so. After all, he did that on collusion. You get the final word, though.
No, look, I think you're making a very fair point. I mean, if you're going to criticize the Mueller report for anything, I think that's it, Michael. I understand why he did what he did. I respect it. Bob Mueller is a tremendously dignified man. And I'm guessing, it's an educated guess, but I'm still guessing that he thought it would be unfair to come out and say, we think he committed a crime. Here you go, House and Senate, impeach him. Here's the roadmap. If you read the report, it's pretty clear what he thinks. He just didn't say it, to your point, Michael.
Chuck, that was excellent. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you.